to Marquette Commons. Welcome to CommonWord's first book launch. We are so pleased that you have joined us. I am Anita Neufeld. Together and with Arlen Epriesen, we co-manage CommonWord, the bookstore and resource center. We are here today to learn about and discuss a fantastic, intriguing, wonderful read, Jamie's new book, Vulnerable Faith. Let's catch a glimpse of it. Fantastic. And now it is a pleasure to introduce the host of CHVN's Morning Refresh and founder of Geekdom House, a missions project to engage the nerd and geek community through the arts, Kyle Rudge. Please come forward.
Ooh, this is nice. Well, I'm excited for tonight. As I was introduced, I do the morning show for CHVN, and I do a number of other things. And to me, the arts are something that is incredibly important. It's something that we need to encourage and inspire. I often feel like when I look through church history that we, as the church, used to be the pioneers of art. We were the ones that commissioned great works that we can still tour today if we ever go through Europe or even through the East. And today, I often feel like we've gone the other way, in which the arts are sometimes forgotten. We're almost the janitors. We're the ones that are following where the world went and cleaned it up. Where we used to be pioneers, we became janitors somewhere along the way. Coming out to an event like tonight shows that you do believe in the arts, that you do get excited about things like writing. There is something very creative about the process, and I think there's something holy about it. I often think about the first verse of the Bible, and if that's the only verse that we ever had, we would find that God created. And there's so much to unpack in that we live under a creative God. And today we've got an incredibly creative author that I'm excited to introduce to you today. This guy is a bit of an enigma. Those of you that know will know that that means well. He is part of a Mennonite conference, yet is with YWAM and writes books about Catholic saints. It doesn't seem to all jive together, and yet, because of who God is, it does. So Jamie Arpin Ricci, let's welcome him as he comes up, and we'll talk a little bit more about his book. Which is your good side? Do you want?
Thanks, Kyle.
Well, here, I'll sit so you don't feel so awkward,
Yes,
whatever else. So I think first, that's the first question I want to ask. Like, you do seem like a bit of an oxymoron. You're kind of like built in all these different parts of faith, and yet it all kind of comes together. What was the journey to get you to combine all of those three things?
Well, I grew up in Rainy River, Ontario, a little town about 3 hours from here. Got some family from there. Yay! We were part of a little evangelical church in town. I attended a Mennonite Christian school, and because our church was small, we didn't have a youth group the whole time, and so I attended a Pentecostal youth group, which was made up of kids from the Catholic Church, the Baptist Church, and so I just was raised with that kind of diversity and appreciation, and YWAM Youth with a Mission has celebrated that in my faith journey as well.
Well, going to the book then, you talk about various saints. This isn't your first. Your last one was St. Francis. Mm-hmm. And you decide to write a second book about another saint. Was there an intention behind that of like, I'm going to make a series about all the saints? Or did this just kind of surprise you as well?
Yeah, when I first came up with the book idea, I was desperately looking for another example that wasn't a saint, not because I have anything against the saints, but I didn't want people to think exactly that, so which saint is next? But when I was working through the content and material of the book and the experience of our ministry over the years, the story of St. Patrick so corresponded in such dramatic and beautiful ways that I just couldn't help but choose it.
For those that don't know the story of St. Patrick, is there a way that you can kind of sum that up to capture at least some of the magic behind it?
The trailer there kind of gave you the very dramatic version, the hipster St. Patrick being captured. But St. Patrick was the son of a wealthy leader in what is today England and a Roman citizen. While his family was Christian, he wasn't. He was more into gambling and having fun, and there were even comments about not believing that God was even real. And then raiders from across the water, from what is today Ireland, came, and he was captured. And he was made a slave, and he couldn't speak the language, and he lived under the elements and took care of animals that were treated better than him. And that experience just stripped him of all the pretense and all the pride, and it was in that emptiness that God spoke to him, and he just surrendered himself to God. And he did so thinking this is where he would die. But then God gave him this vision of how he'd escape, that he would run away through the woods and he would find a ship. And that ship was there, and he actually, after a number of adventures, made it home. And the story itself would end well there.
Yes.
Dramatic ending. The son not only comes home, but he comes home transformed man of God. But what happens is that Patrick decides he wants to give his life in service of God, and eventually returns to the land of his captors as a missionary, even going so far as trying to repay his slave debt to his former master.
Wow. You do talk, though, about vulnerability, vulnerable faith, the story of the book. How does that then link to St. Patrick, who seemed to find this strength in who God is and then goes back and has this strength to bring back? Where does vulnerability play into that?
Well, it was really in the experience of being a captive where he was stripped of all his power, all his privilege, all his pretense, all these things that he had built up to create a facade of who he wanted people to think he was and who he thought he was. And when he was exposed, when he was weakest, as scriptures tell us, when you were weak, then you were strong. And it was out of that weakness that he came into an authentic relationship with God and an authentic knowing of himself, of who he was. And it was out of that brokenness that his ministry emerged.
Well, speaking of the brokenness, the book highlights the 12 Steps program, more commonly known in AA and various other organizations. How did that come in about? Like, you're just talking about St. Patrick. Where did the 12 Steps come in?
Well, I've been kind of teaching and working with this material for over a decade now, and it was actually only in writing the book that the 12 Steps started coming in more explicitly. And I've become a huge, I don't know if fan isn't the right word, but a huge follower of the principles behind Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs, in part because of our life in the West End, in Winnipeg here, and having people in our lives who live with addiction. And I became familiar with the 12 Steps. And what shocked me the most, I think, when I started studying them, was I realized that these were not principles that were specifically just for people with addictions, but they actually offered a powerful path of transformation for anyone willing to be vulnerable. And those steps very powerfully and practically paralleled the process of transformation that I highlight in the book.
Was the book cathartic for you, or did it tear you apart and rip you apart? Like, where is your vulnerability found in these pages?
Well, it's funny because as I was writing the book, I would send in chapters to my editor, and he'd be like, good job. I need you to be a little bit more vulnerable. And I'd go back and realize I was being so clinical. I was being the good writer and having enough distance from my material. And so it was a struggle. And it was especially a struggle because I wrote this book during a year where myself and our community have gone through an incredible amount of tragedy. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder during that year related to ministry, and coming to terms with once being a pastor known for working with people with mental illness to becoming a pastor with mental illness, and then finding myself being cared for by the very people who, I felt I was going to care for. And that was humbling but incredibly beautiful, and it has remained a really powerful experience. And that deeply informed the process when I was writing the book.
I've heard many pastors often talk about when they preach and they're writing the sermon, it's meant for them first. Did you find that with the book as well?
Well, like I said, I've been kind of working through this material for 10 years, and even before the material for my last book. And I think the reason that I waited so long was that process was in process. I recognized that it hadn't been internalized, and over the last few years, it was only when it was internalized that I began to be ready to write the book.
When people are vulnerable in their writing, sometimes there's chapters or spots where they just stop and they can't go on. Or there's that moment of like, I can't, like it's too hard, it's too crushing. Did you have that moment in the book where it took some time to get back to?
Absolutely. There were sections that I left and moved on and came back to, and there were even sections that in the end I removed, not because I wasn't willing to be vulnerable, but because I realized I wasn't quite ready. I wasn't at the place where this was going to be a healthy expression, and I needed to walk this through with my family, with my community. Again, mainly because a lot of the material in the book, for those who read it, this stuff was going on as I was writing the book. A central story throughout the book was never planned to be part of the book, but because it was a very present and real situation, it naturally became a part of the story.
So who was the first one to read it?
Other than my
editor.
Editor? That's a good question. I think Richard Beck. He's a professor of psychology out of Texas, and his material was incredibly formative for me in writing the book and in my faith, and I really wanted to have him read it. The second person probably would have been Jean Vanier, who kindly wrote the foreword.
And for those that don't know who Jean Vanier is, can you give some brief history of the amazing accomplishments he's had?
Sure. Jean Vanier, he's an activist, a writer, a poet, and he's also the founder of L'Arche communities. And these are communities that are creating space and support for people with physical and mental disabilities, and not from a position of power, but from a position of service. So the people who work with the residents are assistants. They're not directors or leaders. And that theme of community and vulnerability has informed all of his writing, and he was very influential. And when I was writing the book, I said to my editor, I said, well, who should we get to write the foreword? And he said, I don't think we're going to get anyone to write a foreword for this book. And then he said jokingly, that is, of course, unless you can get Desmond Tutu or Jean Vanier to write it, ha, ha, ha. And I'm like,
How do you do that? Like, how... No offense. You're a Winnipeg author who's written one book about a Catholic saint. How do you secure Jean Vanier to write the foreword of your book?
You have not because you ask not. I think people just presume, oh, he's never going to do it. I mean, the reality is, I've had as many silences or rejections or twice as many as I have acceptances. But, I wrote him a letter very, very vulnerably expressing how he had impacted my life and why I would be honored if he'd consider doing this. And to my delight and surprise, he agreed.
Well, a little bit later, we're going to have the opportunity for you guys to ask some questions as well. If there's something that maybe I didn't cover, or if you've read the book and you kind of want some clarification or anything, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We're going to move into a reading where Jamie's going to read some of it. What are we going to hear, and do you want to introduce that a bit?
Sure. I'm going to read a section near the beginning. One of the parts, the realities of the book is that it follows a process, and it leads from one stage to another. And so I don't want to, jumping in kind of near the middle would have been difficult. So I chose a small section from near the beginning of the book that kind of challenges our presuppositions about truth before we got into the heart of the book. So this is a story that I really enjoy telling and getting people's response when I teach this material.
Can you do it in an Irish accent?
Not likely. It would come off as a Lucky Charms commercial.
I tried.
Just, in honor of my Irish friends, I shouldn't try. You tried to get me on the radio to do it twice too, but. For the 20-plus years I have served as a missionary, most of the time has been in Canada, and then largely in our current neighborhood in Winnipeg. But I have also had the privilege to travel to many other nations. I've been to a densely populated shantytown near Kingston, Jamaica, and to the plazas of Madrid, Spain. I participated in a banquet celebrating the end of Ramadan in a fine hotel in Morocco, and enjoyed the unequaled hospitality of a Haitian family in a tin shed built alongside the rubble of their home, leveled by an earthquake. Married to an Australian, father to an adopted son from Ethiopia, and another on his way from Guyana. Myself, a dual citizen of both Canada and the United States, throughout my life I have been led to many places. But there's one story I want to share with you now. As you hear it, I want you to create in your mind's eye a picture of the events. I will intentionally only share the barest facts, inviting you to fill in the blanks with your imagination. Ready? My wife and I were away from home and had arranged to meet with a Christian friend I'd known since childhood. When we arrived at the appointed place, my friend was late, so we waited for him to show. In time, he arrived, but to our surprise, he didn't come alone, but was joined by another young man who appeared to be about my age. As my friend introduced his companion, we learned that he was a Muslim. I greeted him with the only Arabic I knew, Assalamu alaikum, and shook his hand. But within minutes of being introduced, I found myself lying face down, both men standing over me, their hands on my back. Anxiously, I waited for what they would do next. As my wife watched from a few feet away, each of them took out a blade and cut into my back. To this day, I have the scars of that event. None of what I have shared here of this event is untrue, and yet, I suspect, none of your hearing has formed an accurate picture of what really happened. Let me fill you in some important factual details. That day, my wife and I were in my childhood hometown of Rainy River, Canada. My friend I was meeting was a Christian from my home church who, along with his wife, used to lead my Sunday school class. He was also the town doctor. I was there that day to have 2 moles removed from my back. The young Muslim man, he was a medical student working alongside our friend as part of his education. As my wife Kim sat and watched, with me anxious about the procedure, they indeed carefully removed those pesky moles, leaving the scars I bear to this day. Now I hope you are laughing, but I wouldn't be surprised if you feel a little bit deceived. Once, when I shared this story with a group of young adults, one young man looked at me with shock bordering on anger and declared, "You made me care about you, man." I intentionally left out details that resulted in giving you a very different picture of the events that happened. Not only did you likely get details wrong in your attempt to fill in the blanks of my tale, but in all likelihood, the scenario you imagined in no way bore much resemblance to actual events. You likely pictured the wrong setting, imagined the wrong emotions, and came to many false conclusions. That is not your fault at all. What other conclusions could you have come to? And yet, nothing I said in the original telling was false. Every piece of information I provided was perfectly factual. Is it my fault that you drew the wrong conclusions? In fact, it is. This exercise illustrates how easy it is to send the wrong message. By simply focusing on the wrong information, by what we include and by what we exclude, we alter what people understand about what we share. We do not have to lie or even intentionally mislead people in order for their understanding of our message to be very wrong. It is in this way that we see how facts don't always reflect the truth. In the same way, we are responsible for the gospel we proclaim. Regardless of our understandings of truth, it is all too easy to unintentionally represent the facts of the gospel in ways that can be as misleading. I suggest that this generally happens for two reasons. First, we fail to recognize that what we share, while rooted in our own understanding and experience with faith, can lack the same foundation, any foundation, in the hearts and minds of others. So what appears to be obvious and explicit to us can be strange and threatening to others. For example, the beauty of the Eucharist may have deep and powerful meaning for a committed Christian, yet without an understanding of the history, culture, and traditions of the church, it wouldn't be surprising that others might hear our talk about partaking in the body and blood of our God as though we were celebrating some dark cannibalistic ritual. Second, misunderstandings happen because we have actually adopted ideas and beliefs that do not represent the truths of our faith. Our beliefs are so deeply intertwined with our cultures, languages, traditions, and even personal experiences that it can be hard at times to discern between core absolutes, contextual expressions, or outright distortions of the truth. Every believer, past and present, has made this mistake more than once. Unless we can claim that our beliefs are absolutely right and without fault, and I would question the honesty and maturity of anyone who made such a claim, we have to admit that we are probably wrong in some, and probably several, details. So we pass those on to others, not intentionally surely, but the impact of those dynamics shape the truth that people embrace. This is why a lifelong embrace of the discipline of self-reflection, both as individuals and communities, living in the dynamic tension between confident faith and the humbling willingness to be corrected, is so critical. It is not that we should lack any certainty in what we believe, but rather embrace a sort of chastised certainty that embraces humility and knowing our own imperfection. This is critical, not only for ourselves, but for the sake of those who hear and see the gospel we preach and live.
I'll take this time. If you have a question, what we'll do is just throw your hand up. I'll point to you. Feel free to ask it, and then I'll re-ask the question to make sure so that everybody can hear. But we got a mic here that we can even wander around. That makes it even easier. So does anybody have any questions that you'd have for Jamie about life, faith, vulnerability, St. Patrick, Ireland?
Tactical training.
Tactical training. There's one up there that I...
That's my son. What's that?
Why did you write the book?
Good question, son. I wrote the book because first of all, as a writer, I just can't help myself. I have to write. But like my last book, this book was really co-authored by my community. You know, it was truths. These were truths that we experimented together with and learned from, and our lives were enriched together, and so it felt like something worth sharing.
Anyone? I can ask, why is vulnerability so important?
I think that at the heart of vulnerability is a willingness to be real about the good and the bad. We sometimes, as Christians, we're so familiar with the language of redemption and the cross that we somehow believe that, almost as though it's a magical thing that happens regardless of us. And while there's nothing that we do that merits that transformation, God invites us to participate in this process of transformation, and it begins at the cross. And the cross is a place of vulnerability. It is a place of death. It is a place of letting go. And that happens only when we're willing to honestly face the truths about ourselves that sometimes are not as pleasant as we like to think. And the Bible talks about when we are weak, then we are strong. And again, we can romanticize that and nod our heads at the beauty of that kind of poetic statement. But the messy reality of that is true if we're brave enough to dare that kind of vulnerability.
Did that spur any questions?
There's one over there.
Oh, there is one. Wonderful.
You already got to ask me questions today.
I asked you questions all morning already. I'm curious, because I want to know for myself as well in my own life. When you're talking with people who are Christian and don't have that humility, who are right about everything, how does your vulnerability and their assuredness of their rightness, what is that? What's the dynamic of that conversation?
Well, it varies. Sometimes, and we've all been guilty of this, but sometimes that kind of confidence is a protection mechanism. It covers up a fear. We've attached that confidence with being accepted, whether it's in a church or a family or both. And so there is, in me, the ego side of me wants to kind of like get in their face and challenge that. But I sometimes have to remind myself, if I'm vulnerable with myself and recognize my own fears that make me be dishonest or falsely confident, my response then is compassion. And I try to make a space for that person to let those defenses down. And one of the most powerful ways of doing that is doing that yourself. The scary thing, though, is that process only starts when someone's willing to be the first person to do it. And I think all of us could say, we can think of moments where we're thinking, I would do that if one person does it first, I'll follow. But Jesus did it first, and so trying to model that by being vulnerable myself, which is, again, contrary to the impulse I have to just kind of get in their face. Sometimes they take that invitation, and sometimes they don't. All you can really do is make the space.
Jamie, you mentioned that you've been to many different cultures. Your book is about vulnerability and faith. How have you seen that, or what surprised you in how differently that idea has kind of either come to light in this culture or that culture? How do you see the navigation of vulnerability being different from culture to culture as it pertains to faith?
I only caught part of that. The speakers are pointing.
He asked about the different cultures that you've experienced throughout, and how has vulnerability changed within that?
Here's an interesting thing that I found, and I don't want to over-romanticize this, so it's more complex than it's going to sound, but for the context of where we are. Take, for example, Haiti. I was in Haiti a few months after the big earthquake, living in the rubble along with the people just to hear their stories. And Haitians are people too. They have their own problems and challenges. But these people who were in the midst of just like absolute brokenness, they didn't have the time for the pretense and the falsities of culture. And their poverty and brokenness just kind of predisposed them to be like, you know what? This is who I am. And they ended up, like, it was so powerful and refreshing because it wasn't always tidy, but it was authentic, and it was real, and it was contagious. And because of that, they were willing, because they'd experienced such brokenness and vulnerability themselves, they were very compassionate in response to it when they saw it in others. I mean, just a tiny thing. I got sick while I was there within the first day of arriving. The medication I was on for malaria actually made me very, very sick. And we were in the home of a school principal. Professional man, far better educated than me. His house was lying in a pile of rubble, and he had built a tin shed for his family. And we sat around outside under a tin roof during a lightning storm in the middle of the night, and it was pouring rain. And I just remember once, lightning would flash, and I'd see my hosts chatting, and I couldn't understand them because they were speaking Creole, and my French isn't quite that good. The lightning would flash again, and I realized the goat had come in and sat next to me to get out of the rain. and I'm just like, I'm so sick, how am I going to get through this? And they saw that I was sick, and they basically brought me into their shed, and to their tin shed, and they had a beautiful bed in there that he and his wife used, and they started laying out tarps and blankets on the floor, and I presumed this is where I was sleeping, and they're like, no, you take our bed, we'll sleep on the floor. And here I am. I'm a little sick. I'm not anything life-threatening, and these people had lost everything yet. But I think because of their vulnerability, it just created a compassion and an authenticity that I've not experienced. We hear "blessed are the poor," and again, we don't want to romanticize poverty, but there's something there that is quite moving.
Hey, Jamie. Yeah, I'm really enjoying reading your book. It's a great read. I'd like to read just a little part right here. In order to truly love this way, to lay down our lives for our friends, we must be freed from the bondage of the fear of death. When we hear that, lay down your life for your friends, many times we just think, oh, it's just some kind of idea, some kind of figurative, spiritual way of laying down our lives. But I think what you're getting at here is actual, death and what St. Patrick went through. Have you come to a place where you are no longer afraid of death?
Oh, yes.
And if so,
I've transcended.
how do we start, or how do we begin to get to that point?
Read the book and find out.
For $15.95 tonight only.
Yes. The Secret. No, I have not. I've not conquered the fear of death. I mean, I think that'll be a lifetime thing. But one of the beautiful things about the process is that even acknowledging that fear is there and that it impacts the way you behave, and that you talk about that openly in your community, it's very liberating. Not only for yourself to be able to, for myself. Let me personalize this. That's my editor always creating. Talk about yourself. For myself, it was very liberating, but it also gave freedom to people in my community to say to me, "You're clearly burning out, Jamie. You need to stop." And I think that piece about the fear of death is something that is missing in most of Western Christianity. It's actually a concept that's very solidly in the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. We focus on the scripture that says the wages of sin is death, and that's true. But there's also a verse in scripture, and the reference is evading me because I'm terrible at references. I'm a bad pastor. The great thing about my church is I can Google it really quick. But there's another verse that says, the sting of death is sin, which is the same concept, but just reversed. And the idea is that this fear of death, both literal fear of death, but also that existential, that fear of exclusion or alienation, can be traced as really at the heart of every sinful impulse that we have. And that we want to protect ourselves, we want to protect what we have, we want to protect our sense of meaning and purpose. And many people attach themselves to movements that can seem incredibly bigoted or racist. We had a group of neo-Nazis live in our block for a year some time back, and they were just so hateful. And it's like, how can they find meaning in this? But it's because there was this sense of, I'm part of something bigger, and this will survive beyond me. It's a sense of overcoming death. And that fear triggers so many selfish motivations, both by Christians and not. And so by naming it, by recognizing how that fear motivates us, it begins a process of disempowering it in our lives, hopefully. I cannot more highly recommend Richard Beck's book, Slavery of Death, which I believe is in the Resource Center, right over here, as well as the other book, Unclean. But it was a fairly new concept to me, but when he laid it out from Scripture, it was quite powerful. I don't know if that got to the heart of what you're asking.
There's another question in the back middle there, blue shirt.
Hey Jamie, you talk about your community a lot, and I was wondering if you could just if you could talk about what community means to you, or what your community looks like, and like what kind of things sort of inform what that looks like, and any way that informs the book.
Sure.
Tell us about your first book, Jamie.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
The cost of community. No, just to give a little background, my wife and I are the co-directors of Youth with a Mission Urban Ministries in Winnipeg here. And we've been in the West End neighborhood for about 15 years now at the invitation of the late Pastor Harry Lahotsky. And for years, like Harry told us, it would take up to 5 years for the neighborhood to even trust us as neighbors. And so we spent 5 years just serving and not trying to ask for anything. And then as we established, we realized we needed a way to connect with our neighbors. And we needed to connect with them in a way that was authentic and not contrived. We didn't want to, there were some wonderful ministries, but we just wanted a place. And so, long story short, we opened a used bookstore in our neighborhood. And I don't know if you know much about the West End, but bookstores don't thrive in our neighborhood. But we knew going in that it wasn't going to be a profitable venture. What we did is we stocked the store with good quality, low-cost books, but They were lining the outer wall of the store, and in the center were couches and coffee tables where people could come. And we just made a space. It wasn't a Christian bookstore. It wasn't an opportunity to evangelize. But we just made a space where we could meet our neighbors, they could meet us, and they could meet each other. And it happened. And before long, we started inviting those people into our lives, and a midweek potluck happened because one of the clients invited himself over one night. And so Lindsay over there just said, okay, let's do it. And then eventually, for logistical reasons, it moved to Sunday night. And at one point, a single mom who was part of our church walked up to my wife and I and said, she doesn't remember this story. It's funny, we were talking to her the other day. She has no memory of this, but she said, I think we're a church. Will you be our pastor? And we're like, okay. And so we prayed about it and partnered with Mennonite Church Manitoba to start Little Flowers Community. Now, what distinguishes us, I think, for the most part, is the fact that we have a strong emphasis on proximity, sharing life together in proximity, not only in the same neighborhood, but most of us either do or have lived in co-housing intentional community. We've started a initiative called Chiara House. It's an apartment building that gives affordable housing to people both with mental illness and people from the church community. And that sense of sharing life together in proximity where you're kind of, you can't have that pretense, you know, you're just too close to fake it all the time. It would just be exhausting. And that kind of just built an intimacy that I'd never encountered before in the church. It's hard work and it's messy, but it's definitely worth the cost.
Got a question up front here.
I guess, Jamie, given the fact that you pastor a group of individuals in your church who, because of their socioeconomic situation, already are maybe more aware of their brokenness and have come to that point. But I'm wondering for other churches, for maybe other pastors who are in churches that are maybe sort of more middle class or whatever, do you have any suggestions about how to help a group of individuals, how to help a pastor to get people to move closer to that point of vulnerability and, yeah.
That's a good question. People often say to me, oh, you and your wife and son live in the inner city, must be so hard. And, they just like, oh, that's so amazing, good for you. And I'm like, you know what? I think it would be much harder, to be in that context you're talking about. So I don't know that I have so much respect for pastors in those contexts. I don't have a lot of advice because I don't have a lot of experience in that. What I would say is I might flip the question and say my advice would be for people who have pastors and say, you can make, it's really the members of the church that need to own that commitment to vulnerability and not place that expectation on leadership. Even in our own community, we have worked really hard to decentralize leadership so that the community owns that commitment to vulnerability, which is why we love Alcoholics Anonymous as a model. A person can be a 20-year sober veteran of the program and with one drink be at day one, and the guy who's been sober for a week has got a week on him, right? And that kind of recognition that we're all vulnerable is kind of the way we shape our community, and that relieves me in a role of pastor from the kind of pressure to be the solution. In our community, my role as pastor is just the gifts I bring to the table. I'm not a paid pastor, so the person who does the administration, we don't privilege my gift over theirs, and that's hard to do. We're in systems where that's hard to do, but I would turn it to the congregations and say it's members of the community that need to gift that to their pastors.
I think we have time for about one or two more.
I'm curious. You're mentioning you're writing this book about saint. You wrote the previous book about a saint as well, and what you're describing about the whole vulnerability thing. What you just said of being a pastor and yet also bringing your gifts to the table, holding yourself vulnerably with other people, sounds very decentralized. I'm curious. Then you dig into church tradition. How do you see church tradition, which maybe isn't primarily defined by vulnerability, how do you see church tradition continue to inspire or be a very valuable thing as you proceed into this way of being vulnerable in your faith?
Good question. I go back to St. Francis for that one. St. Francis is a beautiful example of a man who deeply, deeply loved the church and was deeply committed to obedience to the church as he knew it, which in that era was quite corrupt in many places. And he wasn't blind to that corruption. He named it often, and he lived subversively against it. But he also lived in this tension between the reality of the way the church was and the reality of what the church could be because he looked at Christ. And my nature 10 years ago would have been to be kind of this iconoclastic, cast off the institution, you know, and there's a place for that, but the more time that passes and the more time I spend in the church, I recognize that the church, for better and for worse, is what God chose to be the place for us to encounter this transformation. And these examples of saints within those traditions they become saints in many ways because they're held in tension against the institution, the non-decentralization. And even the people who, like Pope Francis, one of the most popular popes in the last few centuries, he represents the head of a nation. I mean, it's a nation state, and very centralized power, very top-down authority, and yet he constantly cites Saint Francis of Assisi, who, you know, was this poor little man who was pretty much put out of his own order before he died because he just wasn't dynamic enough. And I think that kind of honesty to recognize, even in the midst of flawed institutions, this hope for redemption is possible. That gives me hope, because if I base it on idealism, I'm not gonna meet up to my own expectation, which might in fact be my next book, is finding grace in the midst of radical obedience.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Kyle, for a wonderful evening. I think you've sold your book.
I hope so.
But I think more importantly, you've sold a picture of obedience, honesty, integrity, authenticity, characteristics of faith that are kind of hard to kind of live into, and ultimately vulnerability. And so we want to thank you, and thank you for coming and being part of this.
Well, thank you, CommonWord and Folio Cafe, for hosting this. It was exciting, and thank you guys all for coming. If you ever have questions about the book, you find me online or drop me a line. I'd love to connect about the book. If a group does a book study, there is available online for free at the Resource Center an ebook, a retreat guide, a 5-day retreat guide that helps unpack the book. But I'm also willing to visit groups that are doing it as a book study, so drop me a line.
Excellent.